ISIS was beginning to be formed. And there were Islamic groups that were fighting for power, and so they'd gone in and murdered a number of Iraqi policemen, stolen their uniforms and their equipment to use in future attacks. And the suspicion was that the mayor of Fallujah at the time was involved in facilitating this attack. And I had spoken to him on my own. At this point, I was growing weary, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to be part of this. And so my interview was direct and open and conversational, and he denied everything. He was then passed on to another interrogator who used the Palestinian chair on him. And I did come to find later that he was involved in the attack, and that he had given access to the police station and helped plan the operation.
So he really was involved, or do you think he just said he was involved to get out of that painful torture position?
Well, ultimately, I suspect there's no way to know for sure, but there was enough corroborating evidence. So once he sort of confessed to being a part of it, there was enough corroborating evidence amongst other people, and just the simple facts of what had happened and how they had gotten there, that he had been part of it. Now, in some ways, it certainly made sense. Fallujah was an incredibly complicated place. He was likely a low-ranking member of the Ba'ath Party and trying to secure his future in what was becoming an extraordinarily violent and difficult place to exist. And so he had an incredibly difficult choice to make, whether or not he supported the Iraqi police, many of whom were receiving their payments and their orders from Baghdad, or whether he supported what were becoming more local forces, which was, again, what I think is now more ISIS. And that was the choice.
So would you say on some level, well, this form of torture was successful? It got him to confess?
No, I refuse to suggest that torture was successful on any level. And I'm not sure that it matters, and it shouldn't matter to anyone in this country. And I'm not sure why we've gotten to this point that we start to talk about the effectiveness of torture, as if that makes any difference whatsoever. Torture is wrong. And Americans, all Americans, should know better. I mean, that's what makes us attractive. What makes us attractive is the way we do things. It's the example that we set. What makes us attractive is not how tough we are or how good we are at extracting information. And anyone who thinks that way, I think, fails to understand what this country is about. So I've left that discussion about whether or not torture is effective or not behind. It simply doesn't matter.
My guest is Eric Fair, and he's written a memoir called Consequence about his time in Iraq as an interrogator working with a private contractor in Abu Ghraib prison. And then he returned to Iraq working with the NSA as an intelligence analyst. We'll take a short break. We'll be right back. This is Fresh Air.
Economists say the global economy is in a big fog. Somebody should tell consumers.
Consumer spending broadly is actually strong. Real consumer spending after inflation was up 3% in 2015, a little over 3%. That's about as good as it gets.
Who's right? Skittish economists or confident consumers? That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
This is Fresh Air, and if you're just joining us, my guest is Eric Fair. His new memoir, Consequence, is a memoir about being an interrogator in Abu Ghraib prison, working for a private contractor, and then returning to Iraq to work with the NSA as an intelligence analyst. And, you know, one of his major points in the book is that he really regrets some of the techniques that he used as an interrogator and thinks that there is no support for anything resembling torture when it comes to interrogation. So you were briefly in what was called the hard site, which was the site for the most high-value detainees, where the interrogation techniques were more severe than the techniques that you were using. You didn't do any interrogations there yourself, but you just observed that site for a while. Tell us what you saw.
So the hard site was, as you had mentioned, where the higher value detainees were kept, and I had been asked to come in and observe at least a part of an interrogation. Again, I became attractive in some sense because of my Arabic and because of my security clearances, which I had brought from other places. And so there were very few interrogators who spoke Arabic, and the vast majority were struggling with the same sort of issues I was. That it was hard to know exactly what a translator was saying and what they might have been missing. And so the idea was that I would come in and view part of this and maybe to at least get a sense if the translator was effective or not. And so as we walked into the hard site, it was most people have seen the photos. It's a two-tiered open bay prison, and I think it's difficult to describe quickly, but I would suggest that nudity was sort of the theme of the entire prison. The number of Iraqis that were naked was shocking, and it was cold. Iraq certainly gets hot in the summer, everyone knows that, but it also gets very cold in the winter. This was December. Sleep deprivation and forced standing were sort of were the most common thing that most prisoners were suffering. So they were handcuffed to the cell walls in a position in which they were standing. Their hands were placed down between their legs, and then their hands were handcuffed back behind them. It was simply very similar to the Palestinian chair. Denies you the opportunity to sit down or to rest, and so you could combine what were essentially two enhanced techniques: sleep deprivation and forced standing. It was a shock to the system. And again, I think the natural and very fair question is why I didn't say something at that point, or why I didn't quit. His contractor could have quit at any point. But again, the desire that had been sort of drilled into me to stay committed to things in the United States Army. I mean, these were my comrades, whether they were contractors or whether they were soldiers. I knew the uniforms, I knew the ranks. I knew that, or at least at that point, I still supported the invasion and the war effort, and so I felt that I had an obligation to be part of it. And there was a recognition that certainly war was going to be ugly, and I think I did my best to justify what was going on.
When you saw the prisoners were really being tortured by anybody's standard, did it make you think twice about some of the techniques that you were using?
It did. I think here I want to be careful. What I don't want to do is I don't want to get into a discussion that suggests that there was so much worse going on that I did, or that the book is a project about my own role and about the own mistakes that I made. And I think each interrogator and each individual who is in Iraq needs to come to terms with their own behavior. My behavior towards Iraqi detainees did not meet the standard that I had simply been raised on. It was not the way that I should have behaved. There are long discussions about why those things happened and how those things happened and how difficult it was to sort of break from those expectations of being a soldier, but none of that matters. I made horrible mistakes, and my treatment in things like stress positions and then in Fallujah later participating in the sleep deprivation were abhorrent, and I have a responsibility to confess those things openly.
How did that sleep deprivation work?
Sleep deprivation can work in a number of different ways. So the sleep deprivation that I was assigned to was another interrogator's detainee. We were on shift work. I was on night shift at that point. And so he had interrogated him during the day, and then the idea was to practice sleep deprivation on him during the evening. So he had asked me to go into his cell. He was in his own sort of individual cell at this point, and wake him up every hour, strip his clothes down, strip him naked, make him stand for a few minutes, and then let him go back to sleep. I walked in, I stripped him down, and that is the point at which, for me, the involvement in any kind of enhanced technique or any kind of torture ended. And I can't say exactly why. Maybe it was the smell, maybe it was the nudity, but there was something clear. It was a clear violation of another human being's will. And there's a lot of talk about sleep deprivation. The idea that those of us who have gone through basic training or college have all been sleep deprived. And I take great offense at that statement, the idea that those two things are the same. You can practice sleep deprivation on someone in just a matter of hours. So if it comes to be the evening and you can put them in a room with no windows and it's dark, and you let them sleep for 15 or 20 minutes and then wake them up, they have no idea how long they've been asleep. And you can let them go back to sleep for another 15. They still have no idea. In the course of an hour or two, you can make them think they've lived 3 or 4 days. They lose all sense of time, and they lose all sense of hope. And it, again, without ever laying a hand on someone, it's the very definition of torture.
My guest is Eric Fair, author of the new memoir, Consequence. After a short break, we'll talk about how he tried to reconcile his work as an interrogator at Abu Ghraib with his Christian beliefs. We'll talk about what it was like for him when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. And we'll hear about his life-saving heart transplant. I'm Terry Gross, and this is Fresh Air.
The Neubauer Family Foundation station supports WHYY's Fresh Air and its commitment to sharing ideas and encouraging meaningful conversation. Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Road Scholar, a nonprofit organization offering educational travel adventures for adults to 150 countries, including land and sea voyages to Cuba. A catalog is available at roadscholar.org. And from Chipotle, committed to serving responsibly sourced ingredients prepared with classic cooking techniques, like chicken marinated in Chipotle pepper adobo and then grilled. Chipotle.
How do medical school students learn to become doctors? By opening up dead bodies.
It's hard to, I think, imagine sometimes that it was a living, breathing person.
I'm Mary Harris. This week on Only Human, getting to know the cadavers in the anatomy lab. Listen at onlyhuman.org or on the WNYC app.
WNYC is supported by Arthur Miller's The Crucible on Broadway in a limited engagement, starring Ben Whishaw, Sophie Okonedo, Kieran Hines, and Saoirse Ronan, directed by Eva von Hove. Tickets and more information available at thecruciblebroadway.com.
You're listening to Fresh Air with Terry Gross on WNYC. Coming up next, it's The Takeaway on 93.9 FM, and on AMA 20, it's The World.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross, back with Eric Fair. His new memoir, Consequence, is about working as an interrogator in Abu Ghraib prison and in Fallujah, working for a private company under contract to the military. He later returned to Iraq as an intelligence analyst for the NSA. He'd served in the military before the war in Iraq and had worked as a police officer in his hometown, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. When he was an interrogator in Iraq, he used stress positions and sleep deprivation to try to get more information from the people he was questioning. He now considers those techniques torture and deeply regrets having used them. You are Christian, and that's a very important part of your life. You applied for seminary before you went to Iraq and then studied at the Princeton Theological Seminary after returning from Iraq. But you're right, back in the time when you were an interrogator, you write, I cannot ask God to accompany me into the interrogation booths. In Scripture, God often works in prisons, but he's never on the side of the jailer. He's always on the side of the prisoner. How did you try to reconcile being an interrogator, knowing that you were coming to feel that the techniques you were using were just wrong, that they were morally wrong? How did you try to reconcile that with your Christian beliefs?
Yeah, so the attempt to try to reconcile some of those things started long before Abu Ghraib. As a boy, I had sensed, I was Presbyterian, grew up Presbyterian, a very devout Presbyterian, and part of the Presbyterian denomination is the sense of a calling, a sense that God calls you to a very specific vocation. And I interpreted that early on as law enforcement. And so I set out after college to find any way possible into law enforcement. And I eventually did. Now I lost that job due to a heart condition, and I never accepted that. And I think from that point forward, I started to make poor decisions. And rather than, again, speaking as a Presbyterian, rather than maybe seek out a new calling or to be quiet and try to hear more wisdom or a new calling, I set out to sort of reclaim my calling on my own. And this was the point at which contractors were beginning to hire for positions in Iraq. Now I knew that I could not re-enlist because of the heart condition. And there were certain agencies that I couldn't be hired by because of the health issue. But I knew that as a contractor, I would not be required to go through a health examination. And so that, for me, was the easiest way back into something that felt like law enforcement, which was interrogation. Now, the steps, just the ability to justify these things just kept going, and I just kept making poor choices after that. The idea that a devout Presbyterian is going to be an interrogator in a war zone should never have sit well, and I allowed it to. So when I arrived at Abu Ghraib, prayer, morning prayer, had always been a part of my life, and it had certainly, like many believers, had fallen. But I remember a specific example in which I sat down before my first interrogation, walking over the interrogation facility, and attempting to go through my prayer. Presbyterians often pray through the Lord's Prayer, through stages. And when I got to the section on requests, the idea that God would help me in something, or that God would assist me or favor me in some way. That concept of the idea that God appearing in prisons and never, ever being on the side of the jailer was a shock to my system. And so at that point, I simply made the next justification and abandoned prayer and stopped seeking out God.
When did God start to re-enter your life?
Well, again, as a Presbyterian, Presbyterians suggest that God is incapable of leaving, that we leave God. I don't know if that's true or not. But certainly as my conscience began to kind of boil after Abu Ghraib and Fallujah, there was a desperate hope and a desperate need on my part to somehow find my way back, and an idea that if I could do that maybe somehow I could erase those stains. Now that's something I've recognized in retrospect that I'm not able to do, and that's not the kind of thing God does for us. But there was, I think, a desperate pursuit, which is why I ended up at seminary. I'd certainly considered seminary before the Army, even thought about it during college, so it had always been in the back of my mind. But after the 2 trips to Iraq, seminary was in many ways kind of a last kind of hope for me to reclaim what I'd lost.
But you left that too.
I abandoned seminary after a year. Yeah, I dropped out. I knew probably within the first few weeks, if not the first month or two, that I was not going to be ordained a Presbyterian minister. I'd written an opinion piece for the Washington Post in 2007 about some of the things I'd done in Iraq. And so I was out in the public about some of these issues. And so while I was studying at Princeton and at the seminary and trying to prepare a sermon or trying to read Karl Barth, I was also then visiting libraries or appearing on a radio station and talking about issues about interrogation. Now, at that point, I hadn't publicly suggested that I tortured anyone. I hadn't made that leap yet. But again, my conscience was so stained, and a Presbyterian or a Christian would say my soul was so stained at that point that I was smart enough to recognize that I was not going to be a Presbyterian minister.
Let's go back in time again. So when the Abu Ghraib story broke in the American press and the photos were published and Seymour Hersh had a long piece about Abu Ghraib in the New York Times, there's a piece on 60 Minutes. So the American public is getting very aware of this information that's being reported. You were still working at Abu Ghraib as an interrogator, right?
I believe I was in Fallujah at the time.
So what was the impact of the press coverage on you? Were you reading what was being published? How aware were you of it?
Well, in the dining facilities, we had, the Armed Forces Network, so we were seeing all the same television that Americans were seeing, and we certainly had access to newspapers, so we were aware. And I think, again, each interrogator certainly reacted differently. I know that I and some of my close friends, we were shocked by how shocked the American people were. Now, we were not implementing enhanced interrogation techniques and torture behind closed doors. We weren't doing this and then going back to our bunks at night and suggesting, I hope no one ever finds out about this, or don't tell anyone. This was part of what we viewed as an authorized program. Now, there are all sorts of different opinions about exactly what was authorized and who was authorizing it. That's for someone else to decide. But as interrogators, none of us thought that we were doing anything wrong. There might have been a sense that we were doing something morally wrong, but legally wrong. No, we thought we were. Again, certainly some of those photos were not things that we were doing and had not been aware that they were going on, and we were sort of surprised that was happening. But the image of someone nude or someone being intimidated was a daily occurrence for us. There were certainly again, I've been careful about making the comparison and saying that I didn't do things that other people did. I don't want to do that. This story's about me and my own failures. But that being said, there were images in there that we were surprised by. The mock executions was something I had never done, and I do feel confident that most of my colleagues would never have participated in. I had not been aware that people were using dogs on detainees, but I also was not aware that was necessarily something that was not supposed to be done. I can't say that if someone had brought a dog into an interrogation booth, what my reaction would have been. So.